welcome to everybody. My name is Amelia Fontanelle, and I'm a curator at the Cary Graphic Arts Collection at Rochester Institute of Technology. Since the pandemic times have started, we've started this online lecture series called Cary Zoom at Noon. And so because we had such a great time doing it last year, we've continued, and the content has gotten even better and better with each one. So we're glad you could join us here today to hear our latest Cary Online lecturer, Dori Griffin, talk about a book that was born in the Cary collection. I'm so excited to hear about her experience. Let me introduce our speaker today, Dr. Dori Griffin. She is an assistant professor at the University of Florida, where she teaches graphic design and design history in the School of Art and Art History. As the inaugural Cary Fellow in 2015, she began archival research for the book Specimens, A Visual History of Typesetting and Printing. This is forthcoming. Very soon we hear that they're in the mail as it is, and it'll be published from Bloomsbury Academic Press. More than anything, Dori is passionate about co-designing equitable, inclusive, disciplinary literatures and studio classroom communities for designers of all social and cultural backgrounds. Since completing her PhD at Arizona State University in 2010, Dori's research has centered on the networks connecting professional design practice, popular visual culture, and cultural identity. Currently, she's the associate editor for Statements of Practice and Pedagogy at Design and Culture. And in 2019, she guest edited a special issue of Visible Language titled Histories of Visual Communication Design. Included were design histories from rural Denmark, interwar Israel, Maori New Zealand, and the Ottoman provinces of Syria. But today we're concentrating on her new work. So let me please welcome Dori Griffin. Dori, I hand it to you.
Thank you so much, Amelia. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today, and I'm going to try to do the Zoom thing where I am able to share my screen, and we're going to see how this goes. So hopefully we're seeing my screen. Yes, I'm getting a thumbs up from Amelia. Great. All right. So hi, everybody. Like Amelia said, my name is Dori Griffin. I have my website and my email address up on the screen. I really love to meet folks who are passionate about the same things I am. And I'm passionate about design education. So that leaves a lot of territory for me to meet a lot of really interesting people. So feel free to get in touch if you have questions or follow-up conversations afterward, for sure. I am going to introduce you to my cat Milo, who's a great fan of Bodoni facsimiles, just because probably he's going to turn up at some point. And so now you know that's the cat. However, what I really wanted to spend time talking about today is Type Specimens, which, as Amelia shared, is forthcoming in January from Bloomsbury Academic. I sent an email invite to this lecture to one of the special collections librarians at the University of Southern Mississippi, who wrote a wonderful and generous letter of support when I first applied for the Cary Research Fellowship. This was back in 2015. So I have done a lot of other smaller projects in the intervening time, for sure. But this has been the big project that has been with me day and night for well over 5 years now. And I'm very excited to see it come into being in the real physical world as a book I can touch. And hopefully lots of other people can experience as well. So there's been a lot of discussion lately among designers and design historians, students and practitioners about how the stories that we tell ourselves about design history, definitely based in fact, definitely considering things that really happened in the world around us, but these stories have focused on Western European and North American men designing typography in the Latin alphabet. One of my goals as I put together the final draft of this book was to definitely acknowledge that this has been the story for centuries now, and that there are many wonderful things about this story that it's really important for novice typographers and students to be familiar with, but that this is hardly the complete story or the only story worth telling. So one of the things I've been really focused on as I research and write and source images for type specimens is engaging this idea of networks of global exchange without glossing over the historical ethnocentricity and often cultural or even physical violence that has occurred. So the finished manuscript shows specimens from 24 countries and 15 different scripts. The Latin script is one of those. And there is a digital typographic postlude that's focused on typographic access, equity, and inclusion. Because one of my goals as a teacher is to help us shift design's story toward global equity, toward a fuller and more nuanced understanding of what design is and how it's been practiced by people in many, many places and times, and in ways that might look wildly unfamiliar to those of us who cut our typographic teeth on modernism, as I did in my own typographic education. So today I'm going to be talking mostly about the process of how I got from this seed of an idea, standing in a Typography 1 classroom in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and showing my students the familiar Caslon specimen poster because it was one of the few high resolution images I could find online that had any sort of context around it that I could share with students as they designed their own type specimen posters. How I got from that moment to writing this book, which has definitely been quite the process, and also what's in this process-oriented book that I've been working on for a very long time now. So as a typography teacher, number one, I love my job. I enjoy teaching typography, and I always have a really fun time. When I'm teaching type 1, I often incorporate some kind of type specimen activity for students. Sometimes it's a larger project. Sometimes it's just a small exercise that we use to have fun in the studio together one afternoon. But the type specimen, as practicing designers and design historians know, has been a really important part of our professional identity as designers almost since the inception of movable metal typographic printing in Western Europe. So when I Googled type specimen, this is what I came up with. This is what a Google search result for type specimen looks like. And essentially what you end up with is a bunch of student posters made as classroom assignments. As wonderful as this is not at all what I was looking for. My students were going to make something possibly along these lines, possibly a little bit different. But what I really wanted to show them was that the typographic specimen, this vehicle by which the designers of typefaces sell their typefaces to printers and publishers, and eventually what we come to call graphic designers, this type specimen format has a history and a context, and it's a very culturally specific history, and its contexts change over time and according to place. And this was what I wanted to be able to show my students. Google, even though I'm pretty decent at using not only Google, but many online search platforms, just didn't get me where I needed to go, unsurprisingly, since what I really needed was this. And this is my contact sheet, well, one of about 25 contact sheets from my first visit to the Cary collection, which was in roughly July of 2015. And so as I was looking at type specimens and all of the different ways they could be designed and all of the different shapes they could take, all of the amazing typefaces they could show to me, the viewer, the designer, what I really needed back when I did that first Google search was some archival research. And my goal ever since I had that aha moment, just searching online for discrete items that I might share with my students, is not a very effective way to capture the history of the type specimen as a professional practice or a visual form. I've been working to make this book exactly that, a snapshot of the type specimen as a professional practice as a visual form. So in the Cary collection in July of 2015, I had all of these wonderful, amazing embodied experiences with the received typographic history of my own early typographic education. So these capitals, these majuscules designed by Bodoni in 1771. I actually, with my very own hyper clean fingers, touched those pages, turned the leaves, and experienced the object in the archive in 3 dimensions. I could see it and touch it and smell it, and it was an amazing experience. We're looking on the left at a detail from a Salzman Antiqua specimen that's showing us steps in the typographic and printing and publishing process, kind of as a way to capture this idea of received histories, familiar histories, typographic histories that definitely I had a memory of and an understanding of from my own 3 semesters of typography as an undergraduate BFA student. But also while I was visiting the Cary, I was able to glimpse these holes in the story, these moments of incompleteness, where definitely there are stories that exist, there are histories that occurred, but they're invisible largely because no one ever paused to write about them or record them. No one deemed them important enough to include in a 3-volume history of typography. Which is not to say that those historical histories of typography are not worthwhile. Of course they are, but there are definitely areas that they overlook and moments and entire periods in our history that don't make their way into these familiar histories. So I had this amazing experience with so many thanks to Amelia, and the Hebrew wood type collection that the Cary holds. I got to go behind the scenes and hold some of these individual characters in my hands, which was an amazing experience. I spent a lot of time looking at trade literature, of course, at periodicals. These are a couple of photos from the Book of Monotype Success, published in 1910. So on the top, we see the janitorial staff of the foundry, African-American men. And then on the bottom, we see typists, white women, who are testing speed and accuracy on monotype. And these are not the kinds of things that make it into ad cuts or clip art depictions of the history of printing, but these stories are in fact part of the history of typography. So at long last, and again, much gratitude to Amelia for how she introduced me to the collection at the Cary. I ended up with a proposed book with 8 chapters, starting off with specimen broadsides, wrapping up with phototype. So kind of leaving digital typography and digital platforms to another author. That's another book and definitely would not have fit into the 250 pages I was assigned by my publisher. So there's a very brief postlude about digital futures that's part of the book. I would like to pause for just a moment and thank all of the folks who contributed to this digital postlude. As I was putting it together in my head, I called it the afterword of pure awesomeness, just because all of these typographers, designers, digital pioneers are really amazing people, and it was fabulous to work with each of them. And they, more than anything, are shifting design's story toward global equity. So looking at reimagining historical types for screens, at democratizing types and production methods, at types for social justice, at types for many different global scripts beyond the Latin. So thank you to these folks. One very brief example. So for instance, Lisa Huang's Noto Sans Nushu for Google Fonts replaces something like this wood type in the Oriental style from a turn of the century American specimen book. So instead of a vague idea of what a quote Oriental letter might look like, we have a specific font, a specific typeface, and a very specific script and language, which is brilliant. When you propose a book, you talk to your publisher or your hopeful publisher about its special features. And I thought I would talk to you also about the special features of this book, because I think they show off in a lot of ways exactly why I've spent the last 7 years of my life focusing so much energy on this project and receiving so much help from libraries, from archives, and of course, most particularly from Amelia and Stephen here at the Cary. They truly are this book's heroes. But let's take a look at a few of the special features. There are 5 things that I'm going to talk about, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. And first off, having lots and lots of images and having space to reprint some of those images at quite a large scale was a very important element of this book for me. So one of the things that I want this book to do is provide access to parts of what it means to visit a world famous archive of typographic specimen material, an amazing renowned collection like the Cary's. There are, of course, a handful of others around the world that have really beautiful specimen holdings. And nothing can replace that embodied experience in that moment when you hold the real thing in your hands. But that experience isn't accessible to everyone, and it isn't accessible all the time. And so I wanted this book to provide at least a small taste of what it means to encounter type specimens in their variety and their physicality as objects. So I very carefully managed my word count so that every chapter could be introduced by a full lead spread that had a larger image on it. And then also there are larger images throughout the rest of the book as well. Another special feature, and one that I'm particularly proud of, are the visual timelines that introduce each chapter. So starting off with the broadsides, the specimen posters, and working all the way through to phototype and kind of this moment where digital type was about to be born in the way that we know it now. Contextualizing this story, giving some examples, helping the reader or the viewer to put things in sequence and to relate them to each other in a visual way. And again, the timelines aren't just pretty images to be looked at, right? As those of us who are designers know, images are texts as well, and being able to experience them in relationship to each other and start to understand their stories, not only as individual objects, but also as objects that are created and used by people and exist, again, in conversation with each other, is something that I was really focused on making sure that this book would accommodate. So we're going to talk about images, the visual glossary, and this idea of radical inclusion, all on this one very efficient slide. So there are over 250 color images in the book. And this was really, really important to me on a couple of levels. So if this book is supposed to introduce us, its readers, to typographic specimens, what they've looked like, how they've been made, how they've been used over time, then being able to see them and see them in color is a very, very important aspect or feature of the book. It was also extraordinarily important to me to work with the publisher to budget how many pages, how many images, how many words, and at what cost. There are some absolutely gorgeous collections of historic typographic specimens in existence in this world. And I have visited archives and libraries that specialize in book history, and I have seen them and held them in my hands and read them, and they are amazing, but they have often been printed in quite limited editions, and it's only specialist libraries that hold them as part of their special and non-circulating collections. So in terms of broad access for students, for practitioners, for people who are just interested in type, what it looks like and where it came from, and being able to put that in context, they're less useful. So these color images are about access. So is the visual glossary. So the little black and white images that run down the sides of the pages, they do this throughout the book, define terms or words that might not be familiar to everyday readers or to folks who are practicing typography in a mostly digital context. I didn't know that a tintype and a ferrotype were closely related and could sometimes be used interchangeably until I got started researching this book. So the visual glossary is, again, a tool for access. And then finally, I wanted this book to be as radically inclusive as possible. We'll get back to this idea in just a moment. But why, right? Why do we need another book that is about typography, that is about the typographic specimen, even if the initial answer is, well, there are some books like that, but they've never really been affordable or accessible to a broad audience, a student or practitioner audience. Why have I spent 7 years on this project? And why do I think it's not just a funny little hobby that I have, but something that could be super useful for design educators and for students and for practitioners? And this is why. So we're seeing here quotes that are kind of an amalgamation that in my head I refer to as the voice of reviewer 2. So academics often joke about reviewer 2 who never has anything positive to say. Reviewer 2 is always not a fan of the project. So this isn't all from one person, but these are definitely thoughts that have been shared with me as I've talked to various folks about this project. Most folks, especially teachers in rural or lower income areas, are quite excited about the book. But folks who might be from large major metro areas who have an embarrassment of riches about them all the time ask questions like, why don't you just take your students to visit an archive and see the real thing? It's like, well, I would love to, but it's just not accessible to us. And then the other reason beyond access that I'm so passionate about this project is that there's this view that lingers that it's irresponsible of us to show students or novice typographers anything but canonical works. So only the best typographic specimens, right? And best defined in a very particular way. My response to all of this can best be summed up by this owl giving us the side eye. And that's sort of my response in summary. Of course, I'd love to take all of my students to visit an archive. And of course, obscure specimens deserve to be studied by specialists, but they also deserve to be accessible, and even students who can't visit an archive and see the real thing, or practitioners who can't visit an archive and see the real thing, require some sort of access. So let's take a look at the special features with these thoughts in mind. First, obviously, the images, right? So as I selected images, and oh my gosh, Amelia and Stephen could probably attest to this, there was some agony on my part as I was selecting images, even just as I was flagging images for my photographic request, with the understanding that I would have to edit some of those out for the finished book. I agonized over every image, but it was a delicious agony because, of course, all of the specimens were so beautiful. I was really focused on asking how larger format images can help readers to understand the written text. If text and image are both part of text as a larger idea, then how do the images help readers to understand the written information? What are the possibilities for radical inclusion, for finding examples that haven't necessarily been shown or connected to the history of typography before, especially where English language literature is scarce? And of course, I also spent some time asking myself why color printing is so expensive. In terms of this idea of radical inclusion, I wanted to make sure that at every possible moment, the book was offering its readers not just expected or familiar information or examples that one could find with a fairly decent Google search algorithm, but examples that might be very unfamiliar, especially to novice or newer typographers. These examples probably aren't unfamiliar to printing historians or to folks who have dedicated their scholarly careers to writing only about type. If that's you, I am so much in your debt for all of your scholarship and research and publication. I definitely understand that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. But I wanted to make sure that as an introduction to typography and the typographic specimen, the book offers its readers tantalizing glimpses of what might be encountered rather than retreading really familiar ground that it's very easy to have access to. So that was kind of the guiding light behind this idea of radical inclusion. We're looking here at a Russian history of printing from around the turn of the 20th century. I seem to have forgotten its little caption label, but you can always follow up with me later and I will tell you exactly what it is and where it came from if you need to know that. So this Russian history of printing includes many different scripts, not just the Latin. And it includes familiar moments from the history of printing, like the scribe at work in the upper right-hand corner, but it also shows us some very unfamiliar examples as well. Images, of course, can help us to understand information. So looking at this photo setter image from the front cover of a photo setter type specimen helps us to understand a little bit more about how phototype works, especially in relationship to the written caption that accompanies it and the running text that is, of course, part of the phototype chapter. A few more thoughts about the timelines. So questions I was asking myself as I put these together. How are these timelines going to support a broader understanding of typographic history? What events will help to contextualize ideas that I discuss in this chapter? And then can I offer in these timelines tidbits that might suggest urgent future research directions? So these would be moments of typographic history that will require folks who are committed to writing an entire book about that single moment or example, spending their own time in archives and uncovering new knowledge to share with us. But I didn't want to exclude these moments of typographic history just because no one has written that particular book yet. So for instance, when I am writing about hot metal type, linotype, monotype, they're smaller competitors, I wanted to make sure that readers were able to contextualize this idea of particularly linotype and monotype as universalizing systems, not just of production, but also as philosophies or world views. And so I made sure to include in that chapter's timeline examples from many different places around the world and also many different scripts. Often scripts that weren't Latin were simplified or redesigned so that they would be compatible with linotype or monotype technology for mechanically casting and setting type. So being able to see examples of that in action helps to contextualize the action that's happening in the text throughout this particular chapter. And also, of course, pointing toward urgent future research possibilities. So I spent quite a lot of time, and by quite a lot of time, I mean weeks and weeks of 40-hour work weeks, trying to find a typographic specimen that had been printed by a Black-owned business during the first half of the 20th century. The closest I could come was the Moore Publishing and Printing Company of New York. They were a Black owned and operated printing house with an international clientele, mostly centered in the American Northeast, and very active in terms of Black and specifically African American periodical publishing in the United States. So clearly, we need more research around so many questions, and I kind of hope that the timeline will spark a moment of urgency or interest in a student or practitioner somewhere who can say, ah, yes, this is part of my design heritage, it's part of my story. I want to find out more and tell this story. Finally, the visual glossary is designed to help novices understand more. So typography has a very long history. Typographic and printing historians have been hard at work for the vast majority of that history. There are many, many, many specialist texts on the subject, but what will help newcomers to understand some of these ideas and technologies? What's going to enrich a non-specialist reading experience? I often asked myself as I was putting these together, so as I was sitting in the reading room at the Cary, what was a moment that I had when I was like, aha, now I understand? And I asked myself that question over and over and over again. What was it that helped me to understand an idea or a technology or a practice? And then how can I replicate that as a 30-word visual glossary entry with an image attached to it. Finally, as I was putting the glossary together, I asked myself who usually gets excluded from the story of typographic history. Of course, there are many stories of typographic history. Which ones normally get left out? And how do I invite and welcome these stories into typographic history? Not claiming them as my own, but simply pointing to their existence in the world. So I was considering ways to enrich the reading experience. What does it mean when we say that a language is written in a script? This is part of the hot metal type chapter, looking at linotypes, foreign language matrices, looking at classic Maya, at Bengali, at Hindi, and of course at the Latin script, which all of us are familiar with reading, and offering all of these images and brief texts as a way to enrich the through story about hot metal type as a technological and cultural development during the first part of the 20th century. And of course, I wanted to make sure that I was inviting and welcoming everyone that it was possible for me to invite and welcome. As a teacher in the classroom, I try to make sure that every single student has opportunities to see themselves reflected in the examples that I show. And also that we see examples that aren't necessarily reflective of anyone in our classroom community, just as a way of understanding that typography is a very vast and complex subject to study. Language is very connected to cultural heritage and identity. And so being respectful of that is an important element of learning to be a good designer and a good typographer. This example is from when I was sharing with my very long-suffering Facebook friends about having gotten an email, an automated email from Aleph, which is an amazing Hebrew digital type foundry. And yes, they are in the afterword of pure awesome. But for every visual glossary entry, there is a story, right? And it's usually the story of someone who's felt excluded by design, the way it's traditionally defined and studied and practiced. Often these are stories that my students have shared with me, or they are stories that colleagues have shared with me, for instance, at conferences, colleagues who are reflecting back on their own educational experiences, usually, and sharing a story of feeling very excluded by the narrative of design history. There are 318 visual glossary entries. I did the math. It took on average 2 hours to source each of them, like to find the images and make sure that they were free of copyright, and then to write the definition. So that's a lot of hours and minutes for 318 visual glossary entries, which are just notes in the margin. But it is worth every single second I spent on that task, so that every student who holds this book in their hands will hopefully find themselves somewhere. As I wrap up, speaking of massive investments of time and energy, I want to make sure to say thank you once again to Amelia and to all of the Cary Collection interns, without whom this project definitely would have died 1,000, maybe more, deaths. Their time, of course, is super valuable. There was this rumor that maybe this was the largest image order ever processed through the Cary Collection, and I kind of believe it. These are my lovely carts with my little flags excluding ephemera. And I am just beyond grateful that the Cary has been such a supportive aspect of this process. So I have to remind you, definitely, in January, the book is going to be a real thing. If you like to hold books in your hands and smell them, definitely order the paperback. It's really quite affordable. If you want live links to all of the digital archives where I found copyright-free type specimens, order the ebook instead. I feel like if there ever was a possibility that I have located the right audience for my favorite typographic tale piece ever, then you are the people who can get this inside joke. My sister keeps on telling me that that's not an appropriate tale piece for my CV, that when someone's reading your resume, they really don't want to be thinking about death in relationship to you. But hopefully you are the audience who will love this little historical flourish. Definitely get in touch with me. I love sharing everything that I can possibly share. And again, meeting other designers and educators who are passionate about what they do so that I can learn from you. Thanks.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. So I do have to tell you, Dori, I was in a box yesterday of ephemera type specimens and I found some of your flags. So yes, you have sprinkled yourself in the Cary collection and we keep getting reminded. So yeah, it was one of the biggest requests for digitization and we're glad for it. So look what has happened. So accolades are coming in the chat. I will punch you some questions here. So Isabella is asking, can you tell us a bit more about your selection process on which specimens to feature? So in Columbia, for example, there's a specific type that all street vendors use, but it's not designed. It's not even formal or has a name. Did you look more at design types? So I think she's like vernacular typography or sign painting versus type.
Yeah, sure. That's one of those urgent projects that really needs to be done, I think. I was very specific about framing the project to be inclusive of typographic, movable, metal type specimens, and then the phototype specimens that followed based on those typographic specimens. So it doesn't include things like sign painting or hand lettering. It doesn't include, for instance, calligraphy manuals. Talk about pain, not being able to request digitization of calligraphy manuals because that was just outside the scope of the project. So I think that's one of those things that urgently needs to be done so that we have a record of this. I will plug a recent alum of our program. Dina Bimrahim is going to be talking about vernacular letter forms photographed often in street contexts in Morocco, coming up through the letter form archive, if I'm allowed to mention that. So there are definitely scholars and teachers who are engaging this work, and it's just so brilliant to see all of it. But this particular book defines typographic specimens as a very specific genre of literature, and then discusses how that definition, yes, excludes so many things, but within that even very tight definition, the things that have been left out in the past are rather staggering.
It's great. People are saying they know what they're going to get for Christmas or ask for it. And really great comments here. So pop into the chat there. Just such nice congratulations to you, Dori. I have a quick question. Were you able to consult on the design, or did you design the book yourself? And, maybe talk about that process. We all want to know a little bit about that kind of situation when a book is published.
Sure, yeah. So I was extraordinarily fortunate. I lived in the best of both worlds. I designed essentially a style guide. I laid out one chapter inclusive of its notes and its introductory spread and its timeline. I designed all of the timelines and its visual glossary entries. I laid all of that out. And I was able to send it to the publisher, who then collaborated with a professional designer who executed the whole thing and also made some wonderful changes to my initial proposed plan, just to make sure that we really were going to be able to keep to the page count so that we would keep the price low, because again, access has been such a huge part of why I'm doing what I'm doing, that being able to collaborate with the publisher and the designer to make sure A, the book is beautiful, B, it means what it's supposed to mean, and C, it's affordable, was really a great situation.
Awesome. So I'm dying to know what typefaces were chosen. Just curious.
So it is a slab serif with a matching sans, and this is an embarrassing moment live on Zoom, but I forget the name of the typeface. my type 1 students, if there are any of them in the audience, should plug their ears and hum during this discussion.
Well, we'll all look at the colophon. We'll go right to it when we get to
absolutely
get it in
yes.
our hands. Yeah, and be reminded. No worries there. So, and I noticed the cover, it seems like there's a lot of wood type forms in different languages, different scripts. It was really very appealing to me when I see that in the Bloomsbury site.
Yeah, definitely. So the cover design was designed in-house by the Bloomsbury design staff, and they culled a lot of those individual typographic sorts from the very large high-res images that I was able to send them to design the cover. And again, I was able to consult on that and to let them know how important it was to me that we didn't only see the Latin alphabet, that we were seeing scripts from around the world that might be familiar or unfamiliar. Yeah.
That's great. So Samira is asking a question. So after having this fantastic experience, do you have any suggestions for us international students to discover about our language, history, and culture?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of suggestions. Number one, digital archives are not the same as physical archives, but digital archives are amazing. I sourced almost all of the images that didn't come from the Cary from open source digital archives. So definitely spend a lot of time digging around in digital archives, and definitely publish your work. My second suggestion would be, don't be afraid to apply for scholarships and fellowships and short-term residencies, even if it's only a couple of days in an archive somewhere, even if it's just a quick afternoon visit to an archive on a trip that you take for a job interview or a conference presentation. Thanks to everybody who welcomed me into the archives they supervised while I was in town for a conference. And definitely don't be afraid to apply for funding, because when I applied for the Cary Fellowship, it was a long shot, and I was delighted and thrilled and floored to find out that I had a whole month in the archive, but apply for all of the money.
Yeah, and I want to speak to that a little bit because Cary Collection especially has had a history of being a very Eurocentric archive in our last 50 years. And in the last 10 years, we're trying to acquire materials that speak to those other cultural sensitivities and sensibilities that you mentioned. So what are some of those online and open source places that would give you the Gujarati or the Mayan, different kinds of languages that are documented here?
Yeah, so a few of the images do come from books that were published mostly in Western Europe, a couple in North America. So historically, gentlemen scholars have had an interest in, quote, exotic scripts. Most of them, though, are from books that were published in their country or language of origin. The Internet Archive at archive.org has been an amazing source. Once you've found one image that is intriguing, being able to run a Google image search using that image has been quite successful for me. Using Google Translate to translate a bunch of keywords like typography or type or font or publisher or printing history into as many different languages as possible, and then running those through search engines. You get some weird stuff that way. I have my eye on a delightful Japanese smoothie blender. But, I also found some really lovely Japanese type specimens. And then writing to folks who write about the cultural history of the place you are interested in. So definitely typographic and printing historians writing in English are only very recently coming to be more radically inclusive. But other adjacent fields, cultural geography, political science, religious history, track down authors who are writing adjacent to what you want to know about and write them and ask them questions. Everyone that I wrote to was so amazingly generous with their time and with sending me links to things that they had discovered as part of their own research, but maybe not been able to write or publish about. I think a lot of scholars love to share.
Yeah, I agree. So Maya has our last question, and that is, assuming type specimens and their typefaces are copyright protected, did you have to get permissions for everything, or did you invoke fair use?
So I am not invoking fair use because my publisher, like every publisher I've ever worked with, won't let me. A lot of what is included in the book is out of copyright. So it was produced before 1924, or it was published before 1976 without copyright notice. In a handful of instances, yes, I got specific permissions. So I have permissions paperwork from all of my beautiful contributors to the Afterword of Pure Awesome. Linotype was very generous in allowing me to reprint at no charge a couple of images that are included in the book. So there are a couple of things where I had to track down copyright. But for the most part, these things are in the public domain. And once again, huge thanks to you and your interns, Amelia, because copyright isn't the only expense involved in publishing images. Getting them photographed by archives is also a vast expense. And again, without the Cary, this book would not be alive in the world today.
That's great. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody in the Cary, all my colleagues here, Steve Galbraith, Shani Avni, and Ella von Holtum. And we are so excited that coming in January, that'll be the first thing that'll be cataloged into our library. So thank you very much, Dori. Congratulations on your work.
Thank you.